My name is Ali, I'm a doctor and YouTuber.
I'm Taymor, I'm a data scientist and writer.
And you're listening to Not Overthinking,
the weekly podcast where we think about happiness, creativity, and the human condition.
Hello and welcome back to Not Overthinking. Taymor, how are you doing today? Why can't I hear you? Hello? Are you talking? What are you doing, man?
All right, I'm ready now.
Oh, bloody hell. Right. Hello and welcome back to Not Overthinking. Taymor, how are you doing today?
Doing all right. Actually, slightly less than all right. I just went out to buy some asparagus from Tesco, went on my bike, and I had hay fever, and it's kind of started off this year now. And so now my throat is quite sore. So it's a minor annoyance, to put it one way. How about you?
It's a minor annoyance in the grand scheme of things, I guess.
Yeah,
I'm doing all right. I realized earlier today that I've actually got like 5 days off work, like consecutively, which is absolutely next level. So I'm having a bit of I'm not really sure what to do with my life right now.
Having a bender. 5-day bender.
5-day bender, exactly. That's me. But I had a Zoom call with one of my guys, Angus, just now, and it's just like really helpful just having phone calls with people when it comes to like team stuff, because you can get a lot more done in a phone call than you can over Slack. And
sure.
It's just like absolutely next level. Like every time I have a call with the squad, I feel like we make some sort of breakthrough in stuff. Whereas on Slack, it's sort of just very back and forthy.
Is it like big picture breakthroughs, or like just getting to on the same page faster on normal stuff?
It's big picture breakthroughs more, but it's also like we're trying to do this thing where at the start of the week we'll have a little meeting and plan out kind of the next few weeks worth of content and see if anything needs changing. So that's kind of getting on the same page. But then kind of the one-to-ones are more about, okay, right, let's think about where do our deep dives, live streams fit into the wider strategy and blah, blah, blah.
Oh, okay, nice. That's pretty cool.
Before we continue, we have an exciting new sponsor for this week's episode. Do you know anything about the sponsor, Tim?
No, you don't tell me these things.
I don't tell you these things. So this week, very exciting, we have a new sponsor on board, and that is Brilliant. Yes, that's right. Brilliant are kindly sponsoring our show. If you haven't heard of them, Brilliant is an amazing online platform for maths, science, and computer science courses. So they've got all sorts of things from like, the basics of numbers and probabilities all the way through to other advanced statsy things in maths. And then on the science front, they've got a load of stuff. The courses that I'm going through at the moment are the computer science courses. So they've got one like, introduction to computer science, introduction to algorithms. They've also got some really good ones about like, intro to machine learning, intro to neural networks. And I've kind of known a little bit about neural networks and stuff for a while, just because you hear about them in the news and things. But this is like a very accessible, interactive kind of introduction to those topics. And they've also got a course on Python and then advanced Python. So I'm finding that like genuinely for the first time since I first started learning to code, I'm getting more of an appreciation of kind of the computer science algorithm aspect of it, rather than just these are the mechanics of a conditional state, which is kind of how I taught myself to code. But yeah, if you want to sign up to Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/not-overthinking. And the first 200 people, I think, to click that or to visit that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. So you can learn stuff and also help support the podcast, your favorite podcast of all time. How was that?
Yeah, Brilliant is actually highly reputable amongst the sort of maths and maths education community, because it doesn't really focus at school. A lot of maths education is focused on sort of mechanical sort of processes of like, okay, this is how you work out an integral of this format. This is how you work out this kind of equation, and it doesn't really. Yes, a school-style maths doesn't really focus on developing your intuition and sort of understanding of mathematical concepts, mathematical intelligence, if you will, which is a term that a friend of mine is trying to coin. And Brilliant actually does focus on that. So it's not like school-style maths. It's like it's the way you really want to learn maths. So yeah, I do actually back Brilliant.
Nice. So Brilliant has your stamp of approval, which is good to know. Anyway, there's quite a lot going on in the world, isn't there?
Yeah, it's been quite the week. I think we should talk about what's going on and our sort of thoughts and kind of feelings towards that, I suppose. I've been thinking because, okay, so obviously what we're talking about here is the Black Lives Matter movement, which was recently protests and all that kind of stuff recently sparked by the murder of George Floyd in the US by a policeman. And, lots of people have been tweeting whatever YouTube videos, tweets, and that kind of thing. And there's lots of people chiming in various ways. And I was trying to think, like, we have a bit of a platform here with the podcast. You have a pretty big platform with your YouTube channel. What is like the most useful way to chime in on this? And I'm partly a little bit apprehensive because I've seen on Twitter, there's a lot of sort of people chiming in, in support of this thing in a particular way. And then there's also a fair amount of sort of pushback. And so, I think. So, for example, I've seen a bunch of tweets where someone might, tweet out in support of the movement, and say, try and like raise awareness on the issue or something, and tell people, oh, you should read this or whatever. And then they might get called out for, I think a lot of people are getting called out for sort of not doing enough. And so I've seen instances where some like fairly high profile person will tweet about it, and then they'll get called out saying like, look, man, you're really influential, tweeting about it isn't enough. You gotta, why aren't you like donating money to these various organizations? And then I've seen instances where someone will have, provided some kind of financial support to the movement through donations or sort of setting up some kind of fund. And they'll also get called out for not giving enough or sort of not quite doing it in the right way. And I think a large part of this is just like Twitter being Twitter and the internet being the internet, where the sort of the voices on the fringes get a lot of attention. The reason I'm saying this is it does bring me a bit of apprehension to talk about this stuff on a podcast, because it might
sort of mobilize the Twitter crowd.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I don't want to do it wrong or something. And I think we both have good intentions here, but
So you've not seen my video about 5 lessons I learned about racism or something like that?
No, I have.
You have? Oh, no way.
I thought that was a good video, and I think So I think we have a platform here. I think it'll be a good thing to do to try and sort of help spread the good word about why this is important and why people should support this. And then I think I'd be generally quite interested just to chat about how our stance on these kinds of things has evolved over the years. I think that would be an interesting discussion.
Okay,
at least for us.
Yeah. Well, so I think the first point to say is that I fully empathize with the struggle, which is going to sound weird in this context, but like the struggle of putting the word out. And before making my video, I was also really concerned about this. It's sort of the excuse of perfectionism, like wanting to do it right, but in a way, that being a reason to not do it at all. Like people being like, well, I know I want to tweet out in support of this, or I know I want to do something, but I'm really worried I'm going to be lambasted by, these left-wing liberals for kind of doing it wrong. That seems to be like a genuine fear that a lot of people have when it comes to supporting stuff like this.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a sad place that we've arrived at. I think overall it's still very much the vocal minority of people who are kind of for example, if some public figure were to post something, a lot of the comments underneath that post are, well, it's taken you a long time, hasn't it? Like, come on, man! Like someone is trying to do their bit to support the good fight, and you're trying to knock them down a peg for doing it. Like I can see why you would do it. I don't think there are any easy answers here. And one thing that I've been doing is I've been very interested to see what the opposite side of the viewpoint is about all of these issues. And the more I try and have a balanced view, the more it feels like all of this, like a big part of this just like is massively exaggerated by identity politics. And
yes, I know what you mean. I think I'm in agreement that like even though it feels, I don't know, it feels a bit scary to sort of try and talk candidly about this stuff. I'm in agreement that should not stop people from doing it, and we should still do it anyway. And I think most people on all sides of whatever the sides are in this whole thing, most people are fairly charitable and all that stuff, and it's a minority of people who will seek to cancel you.
Fear of being cancelled and all that.
So I think like a good place to start is, I think you've been doing some reading about this stuff this week. I've been doing some reading about this stuff as well.
So what's been your reading? I've been reading Me and White Supremacy, which I'm about 70% of the way through now.
I've actually been reading that as well. I think I'm less than 70% of the way through. But it's pretty good stuff. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who's also been doing some digging. And I think it seems like there's two categories of digging, which are both quite important. The first is the kind of, books like Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race and Me and White Supremacy and stuff, where it's sort of, I think it's useful. Those kinds of books are helpful to sort of build up some level of empathy with Black people in this case who are oppressed. But I think it's also important to educate ourselves on just like the history of things, because in the UK here, for example, I don't know, like the stuff you learn in history at school it's basically all completely pointless. Like I hated history in school because my impression of it was we're learning about freaking Mott and Bailey castles and how, I don't know, some Henry guy got an arrow in the eye in 1066 or whatever. And it just seems so
Harold,
irrelevant.
not Henry. God.
Yeah, Harold Henry. Potato. But yeah, my take on school history lessons was that this is just like completely useless knowledge. And there's an awful lot of actually relevant and useful history out there that we just don't learn about. In particular, I mean, my understanding of sort of the whole slavery thing is generally that, the Brits colonized the world and had a bunch of slaves, which were predominantly Black people. And that's my level of sort of knowledge about that. And we don't really get taught it in schools. I think in the US as well, I'm not sure what their history curriculum is like, but I get the impression that learning about the history of Black slavery in the US is not at the forefront of the curriculum. So I think it's certainly that's how I'm thinking about kind of educating myself, of like, understanding trying to understand sort of the feelings and experiences of Black people today, and sort of trying to develop some level of as much empathy as is possible for that kind of stuff, but then also learning about the history and the sort of the context of all this stuff.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The history side of it is one that I haven't really touched myself as of yet, but like my understanding of, quote, the whole slavery thing as well is also like it's just something that's not even mentioned once in school. And so, like, if I really think about it, what do I actually know about slavery? Well, in my head, the model I've got of slavery is that it was a mostly American thing. These kind of Black people from Africa would be taken across to America in boats, and then they would be oppressed and made to be slaves and stuff. And then at some point, Martin Luther King, or like Abraham Lincoln or something, I think it was Abraham Lincoln, wanted to abolish slavery, and so he did. And then Martin Luther King came along and gave Black people rights. Like, that is literally the extent of my understanding of what goes on. And
right, yeah.
To the point that in my head, like, Britain doesn't even come into this at all. Like, it's just not even touched at school. So unless you're actively researching this, or it's not. Like, even the whole colonialism, like British Empire thing, it was only really when I was at university, when these conversations would start happening. For example, when a college would host an empire themed night out, and people would complain, and I'd be thinking, what's there to complain about? And be like, oh, okay, the British Empire was actually kind of a bad thing, and stuff like that. Like, I just never come across it before, so I need to very much educate myself on those issues as well.
Yeah. So I think that's really important, and I would, I think that's kind of how I think about it. I think it's sort of, what's going on right now is it feels like we're sort of on the brink of something. It feels like something big is going to happen out of this. And, it's important for us all to kind of understand and appreciate the significance of it and kind of do our bit to sort of support it.
So then, kind of on that note, I suppose not really on that note, like, one thing that I've been really struggling with a lot is trying to develop a mental model for what's actually going on here.
Yes.
Because I suppose in my head at the moment, it's a case of, okay, well, this is not just about the murder of George Floyd. This is about lots and lots of other stuff that has built up over time. The rhetoric I've heard most often is that Black people are oppressed in all sorts of ways in society. In particular, Black people are more likely to die at the hands of police in America. Yeah. And we've seen lots of these situations happen over the last few years. And then it always kind of sparks some sort of protest. But now this is kind of bigger than it's ever been before. This has likely been happening for a very, very long time. It's only really the advent of smartphones that has resulted in kind of publicity being shed on these issues. But then, so that's my understanding of sort of what the main spark was and what a lot of people's beef with the situation is. But then if you look at kind of the right-wing commentators, they would say, well, okay, fine, but let's actually look at the facts. If we look at the context behind every single one of the situations where a Black man was killed by a white police officer in the last kind of 5 years, all, 50 of them that we've got records for, you find that actually it's a lot harder to claim that white police officers are killing Black men for no reason. Like, there's all sorts of murkiness, and like in context, you see that actually this is kind of reasonable. Maybe that was a bit reasonable. Maybe that's not the full story there. Yes, that white police officer was bad in that case, but they were prosecuted and sent to jail. Like, a lot of the right-wing commentators are saying that this whole black people are dying at the hands of white policemen is massively overhyped if you actually look at the stats. And as someone kind of very partial to looking at the stats, I don't really know what to think here, because like 99% of my Twitter feed and like literally everyone I know is on what you and I both agree to be kind of the right side of this, i.e. the left side of this, i.e. the sort of supporting the movement. And yet,
wait, I'd like to take issue with your framing of this as a left and right thing. It's really not a left and right thing. I think bringing like it's not a political issue. It's just like a normal. It's human rights or whatever you want to call it. It's that issue. It's not a left-right issue in the slightest.
I don't know. I used to think this, but
I agree. People have formed factions to an extent where, you know, certain kinds of right-wing people are going to, you know, will end up sharing some particular stance on it. But
so I'm using left and right wing as a very sort of loose, like it would tend to be that commentators that more identify as right wing would tend to bring up these issues, whereas it would tend to be the commentators who are more inclined to identify as being on the left would be more likely to support the move. That's what I'm kind of saying. And I accept that the language is not perfect, but there isn't really a sort of a precise way to talk about this in terms of language without making lots and lots of generalizations and assumptions.
Okay, fine.
But yeah, that's the thing that I find tricky, that like basically everyone that you and I know is fairly lefty, you know, to like, you know, in general, most of the people that you and I know would be lambasted for voting Conservative. And it is considered the right thing to do to vote Labour, to vote for a left-wing government in the UK. And so like 99% of my Twitter feed is sort of full of, you know, Black Lives Matter, the sort of in support of the movement and showing all these instances of police brutality in America. But then if you look at sort of the Twitter feed of sort of a right-wing commentator, you find that like most of the stuff that they're retweeting is examples of all the looting and all the violence that's going on, and talking about how all these police officers are actually really just trying to uphold the law, and, you know, what can they do? They're just trying to do their bit to, and that's why it seems so hard, because kind of like the thing I said at the start is that the more you see that, the more you look at the kind of both sides of this, as you know, insofar as there are any sides to this at all, the more it seems like, oh damn, you know, this really isn't as black and white as I would imagine it is based on my Twitter feed, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure I agree with that. What you're kind of saying is that, you know, you're almost kind of trying to form an opinion based on the average of everyone else, and I think that's just not the way to go. Like, look, I haven't done too much digging into people who have, like, you know, looked into the stats of all this stuff, but I think it is. I think most reasonable people on all sides would agree that there is a serious problem of systemic, you know, oppression and racism against black people in the US and in most other countries. I think most people would agree with that. Now, the thing that's kind of sparked it off right now is police brutality. And, you know, sure, someone might want to try and make the case that, oh, actually, like, the police brutality thing isn't that bad if you look at X, Y, and Z. And, oh, look, they're also like looting or something. So, you know, what's going on there? But like the core issue is something that I think most people are on the same page on, which is this systemic oppression and racism against black people. And I think even these right-wing commentators who you're talking about, who are tweeting about some stuff, I think they would agree with that.
Are you sure?
I think what?
Because I agree that is the crux of a lot of this. But a lot of the right-wing commentators probably wouldn't agree with that.
Oh, really?
And that is another area where I'm just like, oh damn, like, this is just really not that simple, because like, to me, clearly it's just so obvious that obviously black people have been oppressed for hundreds of years, you know, first with the slavery stuff, and now and even now that slavery has technically been abolished, obviously there's all this oppression in all these different ways. If you look at the socioeconomic stats, if you look at the crime stats, if you look at any measure of any kind of outcome measure, black people have it a lot worse than white people in America do on average. And that just seems like really, really obvious, but I wonder to what extent that's kind of based on just the fact that everyone I know is saying that. And I actually haven't thought about looking at the other side and looking at the sort of the arguments from people arguing against that point. Because occasionally when I do come across a video of someone arguing against that point, I kind of think, oh, okay, that actually sounds very reasonable. And then I'm like, oh, crap, I don't know what to think now, because it's sort of like if you look at comparative religion. So looking at sort of there's loads of videos on YouTube for people being very pro-Islam, There's lots of videos on YouTube about people being very anti-Islam. And depending on whose YouTube channel it is, you will end up thinking something different from the debate. If you see a debate between Zakir Naik and, I don't know, Christopher Hitchens or something, depending on who uploaded that, either it's a case of Christopher Hitchens completely owns Zakir Naik and proves that Islam is a complete myth, or it's a case of Zakir Naik completely owns Christopher Hitchens and proves that actually Islam is based on evidence. Like, it's such it's so hard to get to kind of the bottom of kind of what the truth is in that regard, because both sides seem to have very reasonable arguments based on the source that you're looking at. Like, obviously a right-wing commentator on YouTube is going to present it in a way that makes sense. But as a sort of fairly sort of uneducated person about this, watching that, I think, oh, okay, that sort of makes sense. And then I read Me and White Supremacy and I think, oh, obviously that makes sense. Amazing. This is so good. But then I read a criticism of that book and think, oh, actually, maybe that's reasonable as well. Like, that's kind of the issue that I'm having. And I want you to help me with this. How do I sort this out?
Look, I haven't dug into, the other side in inverted commas, but I can't imagine what the other side would be. Like, what could the other side possibly be to justify, centuries of slavery? And say that like that hasn't had an effect on things. Like, really? I'm sure there are in the nuances of things. Yeah, there might be some disagreements, but yeah, I mean, are you sure that this sort of other side exists in a meaningful way by people who you consider to be smart and reasonable?
I think it does. I don't think the other side exists today. Like, I don't think anyone would deny slavery exists. I don't think anyone would deny that it still has an effect today. But kind of,
so where's the disagreement?
Well, yeah, that's where I don't know. Like, beyond those very kind of broad brushstrokes that everyone agrees on, the disagreement would be in, for example, a right-wing commentator is more likely to say that, okay, well, if you look at the stats, the majority of sort of like a disproportionate amount of crime is committed by Black people in America. And therefore, is it really surprising that a disproportionate amount of Black people are killed by policemen? White people are killed by policemen as well, but proportionately they commit less crime per capita. And then and then kind of the opposite side of that, arguing against that, would be like, okay, fine, maybe it is, but there's no way you can disentangle that from the environmental backgrounds, the fact that Black people in America are far more likely to be of a lower social class, and we know that lower social classes correlate with increased crime rates. You also can't take out the systemic racism of the system from that equation, and so partly as a result of the system being anti-Black, you've got these crimes being committed by Black people because they just haven't got any other choice. And then you've got a right-wing person saying that, okay, fine, if that's your point, then that may be true, but that means we need to figure out ways to kind of lift these people out of poverty. But right now, what you're doing is you're looting and you're violenting and like burning the streets, and that's obviously not helping. Like, I don't know. Like, I would love for that. I would love for the pro-Black Lives Matter movement side of things to be clearly the morally and statistically and factually correct way to do it. But I've also seen some very reasonable sounding articles from people arguing that the Black Lives Matter stuff, like, yeah, it's great. Like, the majority of protesters are protesting peacefully, but it's sort of people are arguing that it's become sort of a radical left wing sort of, in a way, terrorist organization almost that is promoting these things for these like 10 different reasons. And I read those and think, oh crap, that seems reasonable. And I don't know enough about the topic at all to be able to figure out who is telling the truth, who is not telling the truth. Because yeah, I mean, I'm like a staunch lefty. Like I 100% want to be on the side of like, tweeting and retweeting and donating and doing whatever I can to support the movement. But whenever I read something from the other side, my problem is that I don't really know how to respond to it.
Okay, that's interesting.
I think it's sort of like coming back to the religion example. Like as essentially a layperson, someone who hasn't studied kind of Arabic theology and like, the Christian scriptures and all that kind of stuff. Lay people like me and you are very poorly placed to actually be able to figure out what to believe in these contexts, right? Because if you talk to a Christian apologist, they will argue very convincingly that the Bible is legit. If you talk to a Muslim apologist, they will argue pretty convincingly that the Quran is legit. And you just don't know, I don't know enough here to figure out what where there is the disagreement here.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the position I'm in. Like, in my heart, I am sort of staunch lefty, and I don't want people listening to this to think that I'm kind of an apologist for the alt-right or something. But also, just me having to say that is this like fear that I have that, okay, maybe there's a bit more nuance here, but I feel like if I were to even step in the direction of commenting that maybe there's a bit more nuance here, what's like, where are the facts, then I would be lambasted as like a paragon for the alt-right or something like that. So that is sort of some of the reasons why I'm finding it so tricky to sort of read about all the stuff, and which is why I'm trying to read more books about it to figure out things.
Yeah, look, I empathize with that. I think on like most issues where there are, seemingly reasonable people on both sides, and where the experts, the experts in inverted commas disagree, it's hard to as a layperson to sort of make sense of it all. However, I think there's a particular kind of thing that often goes on that there's a particular dynamic that happens that sort of presents issues as this kind of, no one knows the facts, no one has the answer kind of, or like, and so, for example, you're currently presenting it as if, there's almost like this 50-50 thing of like reasonable voices on both sides who are completely contradicting one another, and like, how can you make sense of it all? And I think social media kind of, it can make it seem like that. And not social media, but just kind of the way people talk about this stuff. However, I think it's also possible that in a lot of, in a lot of the issues in general, and perhaps in this issue in particular, it might be that like both sides actually agree on like 80% of stuff. There is some nuanced 20% where there is some level of disagreement. However, they choose to focus on the sort of 20% nuances stuff, which distracts from the 80% of everyone actually agreeing. And so even though it's like this thing where everyone agrees about the broad strokes, it ends up seeming like, I don't know, there's some crazy like 50-50 thing going on where like, these guys are talking about looting on this side, and these guys are talking about, a systemic oppression on the other side, and I don't know what to make of it. And it kind of feels to me like this is an issue where it's more like 80% agreement, 20% like disagreement about some specific details and nuances. However, like dwelling on that 20%, I think is counterproductive, because it distracts from the fact that it kind of distracts from the main thing. Like the whole looting thing, for example. Yeah, whatever, fine. It's a pretty defensible position to hold that like looting is bad. Sure, go for it. But to sort of think that talking about looting carries the same amount of weight in this whole thing as talking about the rest of the stuff, I think is kind of misguided. And I think, a lot of the sort of right-wing commentators are sort of dwelling on the looting thing, for example. It's like, okay, yeah, fine. I understand where you're coming from, mate, but frankly, I don't really care about that right now. And I think that's a very, very, very reasonable stance to hold. Do you see what I mean about like the 80-20 being kind of framed more as like a 50-50?
Yeah, I see what you mean about that. I would push back a little bit. I mean, like, I don't mean push back. I mean, I would wonder if there is general, broad consensus about the 80%, then what are people protesting about? Like people are protesting about the stuff that there is disagreement on. Like if everyone agreed that actually Black lives do matter, and that actually, police brutality is a bad thing, and like all of these different things. Like if everyone actually did agree that, then we would have had change by now. And so the only reason for protest is for people who want their voice to be heard, who don't have any other method for their voices to be heard. So I think it would be nice if it were the case that, well, 80% of people would agree with these things, and it's actually only the nuance that we're disagreeing with. But if that were the case, we wouldn't be having protests.
Oh, no. So I'm not talking about this being like an 80%, 20% thing amongst like the population as a whole. I'm talking about this being like an 80%, 20% thing amongst the people who you would consider smart and reasonable and sort of worth taking seriously. I think the danger is when it feels like a 50-50 thing amongst the people who you consider to be smart and reasonable and who you take seriously. That's dangerous, because then like, what the hell do you do? But I would venture a guess and say this is much closer to like 80%, 20% among those people. And it's obviously relative to you, among those people for you, among those people for me. If you are a white policeman in, I don't know, frickin' Minnesota or something, then the sort of voices that you pay attention to and that you value or whatever will probably be very different. And maybe it'll be 80%, 20% the other way. But I think, do you see what I mean? Like, obviously, it's not a case of like 80% of America is like in total agreement about all of this stuff, and people are just like marching around for nothing. I'm saying 80%, 20% relative to the people you would take seriously.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think part of what I'm concerned about is that, like, 99% of the stuff that I read, watch, and listen to is sort of the more in inverted commas, the more left side of the thing, and like 0.5% of what I've been sort of like just happened to stumble across because some dude I follow happens to retweet someone who's like a right-wing commentator is like it's such a small proportion of kind of in total the information that I've been consuming on this. And even though in my heart I know that this is kind of the right thing and that like, all of this stuff like makes a lot of sense, and Me and White Supremacy is a fantastic book, and I'm reading why I'm no longer talking to white people about race next, and I want to learn about all this history stuff. I worry to what I wonder whether I'm actually willfully blinding myself to potentially the counter arguments.
Right.
And it sort of reminds me of we're saying this is, I think another one of the difficulties I have is this idea that this isn't a political issue, it's a humanitarian issue. And yeah, I completely agree. Clearly it's a humanitarian issue. People are dying here. These are people's lives at stake. This isn't really about politics. And yet it kind of is about politics insofar as proportionally, like the Trump supporting 50% of America, which tends to be more on the right, tends to be against these sorts of protests. Whereas the Obama supporting 50% of America, that tends to be more on the left, seems to be pro the protests. And that, it's something that I'm trying to understand a bit more.
I think that's a good point, and that's it's kind of something that I've sort of felt as well, sort of personally. So I think it'd be interesting to hear sort of how your view about all this sort of social justice stuff in general has evolved over the past few years. And I know you dwelled on this a little bit in your YouTube video. I think that's a good video and people should watch that. And so like personally from my point of view, I'll sort of state how my sort of take on all this stuff has changed. And I imagine you will echo all of it, really. I can't imagine your experience will be different. But, so we went to like a boys' school, for like secondary school or whatever, right? And, in hindsight, some pretty horrific stuff used to go on. Rampant racism, sexism, homophobia, really terrible stuff looking back. But it didn't seem, at least to me, it didn't seem
terrible at the time.
It didn't seem terrible at the time, and I think I was fairly complicit in a lot of this. We'd sort of use the term gay as a slur and all of this kind of stuff. And arriving at university, that was kind of the first time I was sort of made aware that maybe that's not okay. Maybe all that stuff that they used to go on at school and the ways in which we used to sort of talk and deal with things, that wasn't okay. And so arriving at university was my first sort of experience of that. And I think my initial reaction to it was sort of to resist a sort of reactionary position of like resisting it, I think I sort of felt, I think in the book, Me and White Supremacy, she talks about the idea of white fragility. I think fragility is a good word. And I think arriving at university and having a bunch of voices saying that, you can't use gay as a slur and, or sort of making me aware of all these issues. There was a level of fragility that within me that meant that my sort of gut reaction was like, whoa, this is like, these people are saying I'm bad and my way of life is wrong. And that can't possibly be true. And so I'm going to resist this. And so I think that was one of the factors. And then the other factor was also that the people who were sort of advocating for all the sort of social justice stuff, they were, I guess I didn't really see them as my tribe. I didn't really identify with them. And so I almost saw it as like, oh, that's not my tribe. I'm not going to hold those views. And it became almost like a faction thing of like, my tribe are, these other people and this is how we do things. And the other, the lads. Yeah, exactly. And it sort of turned into that kind of sort of, I guess you can call it, I don't think identity politics is the right word, but almost like a faction sort of thing where I sort of decided my stance and my interpretation of all of it just based on choosing a tribe and choosing a side and then kind of going with that. And so for the first couple of years of university, I was quite resistant to the whole social justice stuff. And I think, I talked to friends about it and things like that. And I think I broadly, I broadly did not disagree with most of the people who are advocating for all of these things. I don't think I would disagree with any of their sort of foundational beliefs or anything like that. So we were, we should have been on the same side, but I was resistant to it for this like tribalism sort of thing, and for from the like fragility point of view. I think after a couple of years, I started coming around. And I think since graduating from university, I think now that I'm sort of outside that bubble of tribalism and things like that, and I feel like actually one of the biggest shifts since graduating from university is just, sort of being able to make my mind up much more independently about things. Like looking back, there wasn't too much independent thinking going on for me at university. It was mostly like picking sides on various issues based on factions and things. But I think since graduating and being outside of that bubble, I've been able to kind of take a step back and think from, you can call it from first principles or whatever, and I find myself a lot more sympathetic to all the stuff that the in inverted commas social justice warriors at university were going on about. I'm much more sympathetic to it now, and much more sort of receptive to supporting all of that stuff, if that makes sense. And I suspect the whole thing, where this does turn into like a left versus right thing, I think it basically comes down to those two things I mentioned: the fragility and the like tribalism thing of like, oh no, these people are like shouting at me that I'm racist or something. This doesn't feel good, and they're saying I'm a bad person, and that can't possibly be right. And B, like, that's not my tribe. That's this is my tribe, and this is how we do things. And so I'm going to be against it. And so I suspect a lot of the people who would disagree with the movement or whatever it's like a reactionary thing that I can kind of empathize with, because that's sort of how I was not too long ago,
Yeah, I broadly agree. I think I had pretty much identical experiences where kind of for the first few years of university, I'd be sort of, what's the difference between making a sexist joke and making this sort of joke? Be like, it's really not that bad. And like all these sorts of, I think I started coming around in third year just through kind of war of attrition by having this kind of debate with so many of my SJW friends over a very long period of time. And so kind of realizing, actually this stuff is kind of legit. And that yes, like fine, free speech and all that stuff, I can make a sexist joke if I really want to, but it just makes me a bit of a dick. And that was sort of the position that I ended up because I think one of the common sort of fragility / tribalism responses to this sort of stuff is by bringing it down to a case of civil rights. Like, well, I've got freedom of speech. You can't infringe on my freedom of speech by compelling me to use this gender pronoun. And I think a lot of the right would frame the debate around the legal / compulsion side of things and sort of hold up free speech as like this ultimate virtue. Whereas what people like us would say would be like, okay, fine, I can't compel you to use a pronoun. But, if you're misgendering someone on purpose, then it just makes you a bit of an asshole. And I think early on in my university career, I was more focused on, well, technically this isn't true because blah, blah, blah. Whereas now I'm more like, okay, I get that your lived experience of this is a certain way. And given my privilege in all these different domains, I don't really have a leg to stand on to kind of deny your lived experience of this. And that's another part of why the sort of the pro Black Lives Matter thing, which just sounds weird to say because obviously, why does it even need to be said? But like, that's a big part of why the pro Black Lives Matter side of this, like, has to be right in all these different ways, because you've got like the vast majority of Black people in America, if not the world, saying that, we experience racism on a daily basis. This is real. This is legit. And most of the people arguing against it are white people, mostly white men, who are saying, oh, actually, I don't think your experience of racism is that legit because A, B, C, D, and E. And to deny the experiences of someone else having an experience that you can't possibly have lived through just seems like absolutely absurd. And so, so kind of to echo my kind of viewpoint on this, I fully support the movement. I would just love to be more educated about it so that I've got kind of responses against some of the criticisms of it, which currently I don't have responses.
Yeah, that's fair. I imagine a lot of the decent chunk of our listeners who might, I imagine a decent chunk of them would be in the same boat now that you and I were at the start of university, where you're starting to hear about all this like social justice stuff. It all seems a bit extreme, like you kind of don't want to go along with it. And I think, I'd encourage anyone who's feeling that way to sort of try and ignore the fragility stuff and try and ignore the tribalism stuff, and just try and see what the actual issue is. And I think most reasonable, compassionate people would would actually be in support of all of it. But I do feel like when it comes to these issues, the communication is just it's difficult. I think communication from one side to the other is just quite poor, I think. And so in me and White Supremacy, and you mentioned this in your video as well, I think one of the really good points that she made was that a lot of people, when confronted with, for example, a black person talking about their experiences of racism and things, a lot of people might start doing what's called tone policing at that point, where if the person who's trying to describe their experiences of oppression to you, if they're sort of emotional about it, or if they're sort of frustrated or angry or anything like that, if they're not basically speaking in a completely neutral, dispassionate sort of tone that appeals perfectly to you, you wouldn't be receptive to it, and you'll kind of dismiss them because, I don't know, they seem a bit nuts or whatever. And I think I did a lot of that at university. And yeah, I think there was a lot of internal tone policing on my side, where I'd kind of see the way in which people were talking about these things and be like, oh man, those people seem a bit nuts. This isn't for me, man. Come on, get a grip, be reasonable, chill out. Then we can have a discussion. That was kind of my view on it. And I imagine many listeners might share that view. And the thing is, I think on an individual level, it's I think that the tone policing thing is not a good thing. And the way, just because someone is saying something in a way that doesn't particularly appeal to you, it doesn't diminish from the content of what they're saying. And to focus on the way that they're saying it rather than the sort of content is pretty unfair. However, I think the reason, I think if you kind of, if for example, someone is sort of emotionally or angrily explaining to you the ways in which they've been sort of mistreated and oppressed, there's two sort of responses to it. One response is the sort of tone policing response, which is kind of oh man, why are you yelling? Just sit down, chill out. Then maybe we can talk. I can't take you seriously like this. That's one response. And the other response is, this is my fellow man. They're clearly upset about this thing. I have concern for my fellow man. And it's not good that they're upset. And I'd love to understand why and do whatever I can to help them. And I think the reason why someone would land on the tone policing side rather than the compassionate camaraderie side is, I think it kind of comes down to, I feel like it just has to come down to the factions thing. Because if someone if someone who you saw as being in your own faction was upset, frustrated, emotional, angry about something, you'd be receptive to it. You'd think, man, this is my faction comrade. If they're upset about this thing, there must be something to it. We got to put this right. Whereas if you see that same kind of communication style from someone of the opposite faction, you kind of you don't interpret it in the same way. And so I really feel like a lot of this just comes down to sort of reactionary tribalism, and a lot of our responses to all of this stuff is just kind of dictated by that,
Yeah, absolutely. I think different sorts of arguments appeal to different sorts of people as a result of this kind of tone policing thing. And I was very much sort of massively guilty of that kind of when I was at university. And I still think internally I do this to an extent even now, which is that I would consider myself a fairly sort of logical, rational sort of guy who doesn't get emotional about things very much. And so exactly the same argument about why, exactly the same argument about anything, why these protests are important and why they're actually legit and why we shouldn't focus on the violence and the looting and why police officers need to be reformed. Exactly the same argument delivered by someone who is doing it in a neutral, dispassionate sort of, effectively exactly the same argument delivered by a white man and all the baggage associated with that. I think deep down internally, I'd be more convinced than, for example, if it were delivered by someone who was saying the same points, but doing it as sort of loudly, emotionally while they were crying, just to sort of take two huge extremes of the thing. And that's really bad. And that's something that I'm kind of actively trying to work on. And I suspect that if most people are being honest, then you're more likely to be receptive to an argument that is coming from the sort of person that you more identify with.
Yeah, for sure.
So, for example, one of yours or mine, I don't know, black women social justice warrior type friends would would not be at all receptive to an argument from someone like Sam Harris, whereas someone like you and me, for example, or most of our friends would be reasonably receptive to an argument from someone like Sam Harris. It's just so bad, and it's so hard to get over that. But I suspect, obviously the first step is to recognize that it's an issue, and then to
I think it's really hard to get over that. And I think I feel like a lot of people on the other side of this are grappling with that, and I remember one thing that I always used to get hung up on in these discussions at university was this whole thing that many people say of like, this thing that you can't be racist to white people. And that I used to kind of get hung up on that because it didn't quite feel right. And I think a lot of people get hung up on that. And,
I think they did. That was a huge chunk of the comments on in response to my video.
Yeah. And I think of course, like the tone policing isn't right. It's, it's not a reasonable thing to do. But like, I think, lots of people are doing it, and yes, we should try and convince them not to do it. But it also helps to sort of frame things in a way that other people might be more receptive to. And I think that the sort of the framing of like, you can't be racist to white people is something that I think I still don't quite agree with it, because it's sort of like a definitions thing.
It's a very much semantics game. Yeah,
it's like a pure semantics thing that sort of inflames a discussion, because if you read a dictionary or whatever, and for most people growing up, for example, I'm going to speak for the UK or whatever, but like most people growing up here, the working definition of racism that the vast majority of the population subscribes to is racism is when you are, I'm sort of
when you're mean to someone because of their race.
Yeah, when you're mean to someone because of the color of their skin. That's what racism is. And to say to someone you can't be racist to white people, it's like you're sort of redefining it. And that's fine. I think it is a reasonable thing to redefine, but it is more helpfully framed in a different way rather than just saying something that completely contradicts most people's definition of it. And the way I wish I'd sort of thought about this a lot sooner is that kind of that there is if you're thinking about people being mean to other people because of their skin color. There's a lot of different ways to do that. There's like, some white kid in the playground might get name called a particular word or something, and that's someone being mean to them because of their skin color. And then there's also the being mean to someone because of their skin color, where black people, fear sort of any kind of confrontation with law enforcement because there's a much higher chance they'll get unjustly killed. There's also the sort of being mean to people because of their skin color, where a black person wouldn't be hired despite being more qualified than the equivalent white person, all of this kind of stuff. And a white guy in the playground being called a cracker or whatever is obviously very different to, it's a very different kind of being mean to someone for their skin color than all the other stuff we're talking about. And the main difference is sort of the systemic nature of the racism against black people. And so it doesn't really make sense to have this one word, racism, referring to such a wide range of things. And really the much more meaningful sort of sense of racism is the systemic systemic oppression of black people. That is far more meaningful than the kind of surface level being mean to someone because of their skin color. And that's like the real issue that needs to be sorted out and talked about. And that's why it makes sense to redefine racism as specifically, being mean to someone because of their skin color in a way that is complemented by some kind of power structure that leads to sort of systematic oppression. That's the real issue. And I think framing it that way, I would have been very, very receptive to it. But I think a lot of the time it was just framed as this like, nope, you can't be racist to white people. And my interpretation of that was almost like it's fair game to be mean to white people because of their race, and that obviously doesn't sit right. I think most people who are going by the normal definition of racism, if you tell them you can't be racist to white people, no, there's no such thing as being racist to white people. I think most people would interpret that to mean that this person is saying it is fair game for me to be mean to someone to a white person because of their skin color. And I think most people wouldn't want to subscribe to that. And at that point, it's like, okay, this person is saying you can't be racist to white people. That's obviously not true. I mean, come on, man. Like, how can I take this person seriously at this point? And so I think it's helpful to actually frame things in the right way to, to sort of accomplish the goal of communication, right? And so, yes, tone policing is bad. You shouldn't do it. But also for for people who want to communicate with people who disagree on these issues, like, it's helpful to sort of frame things in a way that appeals to the other side, right?
Yes. I think you've really sorry, finish your point and then I'll say something.
And yeah, like, even you, for example, actually, I'm curious to hear your take on this. So, like, in your YouTube video, you made this point of, like, race, of, like, you can't be racist to white people. And you framed it in the classic way of just saying, actually, I found out that in the book she says you can't be racist to white people. And here's why. And you kind of stuck within the same frame, which I think was unhelpful. And then you also tweeted something about, like, man, white people really get triggered when you say you can't be racist to white people or something. I'm curious as to, like, what the thought process was there. And as someone trying to, like, communicate about this stuff, why did you fall into that?
Okay, that's a good question. So in my video, I'm going to remind myself what I said. Okay, so in my video, the point that I was making was about educating myself. And it was about kind of this transformation that I had at university, where I went from thinking, clearly this is BS, that you can't be racist to white people, to being like, oh, okay, fine. The reason you're saying that is because there's this system of this systemic oppression, plus being mean to someone because of their race, and that's what makes it racism rather than prejudice. Oh, okay, I understand that now. And the point I made was that I realized that these people are, like, essentially black people have enough on their plate. And educating me is something that I should take into account myself, rather than relying on my black friends to educate me. That was sort of the wider point. I don't think there was anything particularly controversial about that, because I did explain the definition of it. I probably should have, if the point of that video was to change someone's mind who did not believe it, then I did a bad job. That wasn't really the point of the video. I wasn't really thinking about what is the point of this. I was more thinking that, okay, my only objective here is to encourage people to educate themselves, because I actually don't know shit. I do not know what I'm talking about. But I do know that I've sort of made a few transformations in my thinking over the years through trying to educate myself. Okay. That was the only objective of that video. Had I been trying to sort of change a white person's mind about why you can't be racist to white people, I would have sort of given it a much more sort of proper analysis, and probably come to your side and be like, okay, guys, like, the reason we're worrying about this is because we disagree on the definition of racism. Your definition of racism is as such. This used to be my definition as well, and then I realized that all this and that, and read the book to find out more. That wasn't the objective.
Okay, fair.
I think the more interesting side of it is why I tweeted the phrase, damn, white people really get triggered when you say you can't be racist to white people. Partly it was playing into the Twitter, into the sort of what one does on Twitter.
Wait, what does that mean? What do you mean by that?
As in, it's an anti-white people tweet. It's deliberately inflammatory, and it's good, and it will appeal to it will appeal to the left. Because it's a sort of statement that everyone who has had a chat with white people about racism can resonate with. That, damn, white people really get triggered if you say you can't be racist to white people. Partly the word trigger as well is also a cheeky nod, if you will, paying homage to that kind of left-wing term usually. It was sort of playing the game of sort of piling on this. I got a little bit of a kick out of tweeting that, thinking that, I'm an agent of the left. I can also kind of toss out this zinger without worrying, without actually having, without it being designed to change anyone's mind. Purely, this is pure tribalism, 100%. that was the reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
The point I was going to make aside from that is that I think this idea of the tone in which you say something does matter, even though tone policing is bad. I think that's a really good point. And I think that is probably where people like you and me can actually make some semblance of a difference in this debate. Like, you and I do not experience, racism to anywhere near the extent that our black friends do, or that our black friends in America would. I think you and I, given that we have a platform and, are, quote, reasonably smart people, what we can do is we can form the case for, form the case for the left, as it were. And I would love for there to be a better way of framing that, because I know people are going to email and be like, oh my God, it's not really about, I get it. It's an imperfect way of phrasing it. But I think, kind of going back to the point, I think you and I can make a difference in that we can form the case for the left in a neutral, dispassionate, analytical fashion, which would appeal to the sorts of people like us who are more on the right, who are probably white dudes, who are genuinely thinking that, well, what's going on here? Clearly there's something to it. They're like, I'm open to having my mind changed on these issues but it would be nice if they were presented in the right way. And we can say all we like that actually, guys, in an ideal world, you white people would educate yourself and you wouldn't require, a brown person to teach you about racism and stuff. But that is, if we want to affect change in the world in any small way, we do, like, unfortunately, the burden of work, the proof of work, as it were, it kind of needs to come from our side, because thanks to inertia and thanks to white supremacy and white privilege and white fragility and white silence and all of these different things, there is no incentive for white people to change their mind. Whereas we are very much incentivized to want them to change their mind. And therefore, if we can present all of these things in an analytical, dispassionate, neutral way that would engage those sorts of people, that would actually be a value add. Because from trying to find this stuff, I've come across very few examples that are framed in the sort of way that would have appealed to me when I was 21 years old.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why, at the moment, my YouTube's homepage suggestions is Steven Crowder. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
No.
He's like sort of this huge kind of he's arguably alt-right commentator who makes videos and sort of makes fun of all these things like, gender issues and transgender people. And he kind of goes on university campuses in America. It gets invited by the Republican societies, and all the liberals protest and demand he be taken off campus because what he's shouting is sort of like alt-right Nazi ideology. That is the sort of dude this guy is. But my whole YouTube homepage is sort of his videos now, because he's got a load of videos about these things. And from watching some of them, I've been thinking, oh, damn, these are actually really good points. I need a good analytical way to dismantle these points, and I don't have that yet. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of when it comes to investigating any ideology that we hold close to us. For example, let's say for the sake of argument, let's say you were born into a Muslim family and you've been Muslim all your life. And now you're thinking, okay, let me actually figure out why I'm Muslim and what the deal is here. I think an effective way of going about that is to try and find all of the positions that disagree with you, and then see if you can kind of dismantle those, because you're already starting from such a huge bias towards being Muslim. Equally, from my end, I'm starting with such a ridiculously huge bias towards being pro-Black Lives Matter, pro-everything, pro-left, pro-choice. I think that's like a left. Basically, I'm a staunch lefty in every single way, but that is such a huge bias that I'm trying to actively figure out what the other side is saying so that I can educate myself enough to be able to provide a neutral, dispassionate, reasoned response to it as someone with enough privilege that this issue doesn't actually affect me as much as it affects other people. And for those people, I can completely appreciate and imagine that, what you don't, that it might not be possible, if even desirable, to form a fully neutral, dispassionate analysis of the situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you kind of made 2 points there. I think I definitely agree with your first about, one thing that you and I can do is sort of frame these things in a way that would have appealed to us back in the. I would say we are sort of the newly woke, nouveau woke, if you will, and pre that, we should frame things in a way that would appeal to people who aren't quite there yet. And I think that's something useful we can do. With regards to the thing about if you strongly sort of fall on one side of a thing and you want to learn more, then it's useful to kind of hear the other point of view. I think I agree with that, with the caveat that there are a lot of, cognitive is the wrong word. There are a lot of sort of rhetorical isn't quite the right word, but that there are a lot of traps you can fall into if you are approaching things from a critical lens. I think, for example, it comes back to kind of what I was saying where, let's say, you're strongly pro Black Lives Matter. It's a stupid phrase to say strongly pro Black Lives Matter, but Black Lives Matter as in the movement rather than the sentiments that Black Lives Matter. Okay. So let's say you're strongly pro Black Lives Matter and you're okay, I want to try and see the other side. I actually think it's not generally to understand the other side of something. It's not generally good to understand any side from a critical point of view. To get to the heart of, the Black Lives Matter movement, I don't think it's that helpful to approach it from a critical angle. And to get to the heart of why the people against the movement feel the way they feel, I don't think it's helpful to approach it from a critical angle. I think if you really, I think, there are going to be reasonable sounding, valid sounding criticisms to any and everything under the sun. Critiquing something is trivial. You can do it for basically anything. And it's very easy to use rhetoric and sort of frame things in a way that makes a critique sound reasonable and sophisticated and all that stuff. And it's a very easy trap to fall into where, you read a critique of something that sounds pretty smart, or maybe they've got a point there or something, and it's easy to sort of fall into the trap of like, I think putting a high value on like a critique of something, and also like giving every voice and everything an equal weighting. So, for example, one thing that I think is really sort of distracting from the point of all of this is the whole sort of side quest of the looting thing, and like, I think raising the issue of like the looting or whatever, it's kind of leading people down this side quest of giving equal weight to the looting issue as they are giving to the wider issues, which I think is not the right way to approach this. So I think yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to disagree with you on a point there, and you'd probably agree with this, but like, given that the ultimate objective is to try and change people's minds, the people who are kind of against the Black Lives Matter movement are the people who are focusing on issues like the looting. Just to give us the side quest of the looting, which we know to be a completely side issue that actually detracts from the main issue. But the people who are against Black Lives Matter are holding that up as a reason to not support the movement. And so in order to engage with those sorts of people, you have to, I'm going to sound very sort of non-woke by saying this, but you have to engage them in some kind of dialogue about the issue that they are currently talking about. Like, the reason people are focusing on the looting, for example, is because the media has been focusing on the looting. And to change people's minds about that, you have to give them some compelling evidence as to why they shouldn't care about the looting and what the major issues are. And I think given that the ultimate objective is to change people's mind, I think it is helpful to approach it and be like, okay, what are the critics saying? What's Fox News saying? What are the Trump supporters listening to? And sort of making that as a reasonable starting point for, okay, here's a point about the facts about police brutality. Here's a point about the facts about, the disproportionate crime rate for Black people. Here's a point about how they're burning and causing more damage to the economy than has been seen since the Great Depression. Like, for example, I don't think that's the points they're making, but at least it gives you a sort of list of 1, 2, 3 that, okay, now while I'm reading this book or that book, or watching this video from Emmanuel Acha, or watching this thing, or watching, I don't know, watching anything to educate, then you've got this sort of list of talking points where you're like, okay, I'm trying to figure out answers to these questions, because predominantly I agree with what is being said. I'm fully pro #Black Lives Matter, but I need to create responses to these. And that's why I think it is helpful to figure out what the salient points of critique are, so that you can figure out how to get on top of them in the course of your reading. It's sort of like when you're preparing for an essay at university, having the title of the essay in mind helps guide your reading. Whereas if you just sort of read a book just for the sake of understanding, it's a lot harder to then sort of you then have to reread the book to pretty much form your essay.
Yeah. Look, I don't disagree with any of that. But the point I was trying to make was that it's an easy trap to fall into, to get too caught up in like the sort of the critical view of things, where it's like point, counterpoint, counterpoint, getting caught up in those kinds of trains of thought.
Why is that bad?
Sorry?
Why is that bad? Like, point, counterpoint is how you change people's minds about things.
No, okay, so I think that's fundamentally where we disagree.
It's part of how you change. It's how you change the people's minds about things. Kind of, it's how you would have changed 21-year-old me's mind about things, and that is the sort of person that I'm personally targeting as the person whose mind I can change. It's not by appealing to, oh my God, guys, the plight of these people is really bad, have a heart. Like, that is not how you change 21-year-old Ollie's mind. You change him by being point, counterpoint to the point that he can't argue anymore.
I don't think the opposite of point, counterpoint is have a heart, man. Come on, be nice or whatever. I don't think that's the opposite of it at all. And look, it's possible that if someone sat you down and had a point counterpoint style discussion with you about something, you might then change your mind on it. However, I think that the reason I'm skeptical of that view of things on the internet is because it's not a clear one-to-one sitting down with someone and having this point counterpoint thing. It's not like that at all. It's like very meandering. Okay, so the point counterpoint thing, if you have that as a one-on-one thing with someone in real life, or fine over text or whatever, you're both sort of on the same page, and the sort of path that you're drawing out is this sort of zigzagging path going downwards towards the truth or whatever, right? That's kind of how you imagine it, right? However, I think if you are trying to educate yourself about a topic on the internet and you try and approach it in that particular way, it doesn't end up as this nice, neat, zigzagging path down towards the truth, but it actually ends up as this sort of zigzagging, ever-expanding tree of like, counterpoints that are sort of actually kind of tangential, and then like you'll go down some tangents that aren't actually that related to the main point, and then other counterpoints where the guy sounds really smart or something, what he's actually saying is complete bollocks, but you're not smart enough to read through the rhetoric. Like it's
okay. I think you're
in theory.
I think you're imagining me having this sort of point counterpoint discussion with someone on Twitter. I'm not imagining that at all. I'm imagining
No.
understanding point counterpoint in the format that the courage to be disliked is written.
Okay, yes, but I think that's good. Okay, well, how do we get onto this discussion? I think we're sort of losing track of the context, and I think this is an example of why the point counterpoint thing doesn't quite work.
Okay, so the reason we got onto that is because we were talking about what we can personally do, and I was saying that the reason I'm watching alt-right videos is because I want to figure out what their main counterpoints are, so that I can build a sort of neutral, dispassionate defense of kind of the pro-life, Black Lives Matter movement based off of that in the format of the courage to be disliked. Whereas, it's that classic thing of like to really fully understand a topic, you need to be able to argue the other side of it as more convincingly than the other side can.
Yeah.
And I think once you've done that, you can then build a sort of here is a sort of point counterpoint, and for me, what I'm imagining is that if I were to make a YouTube video, for example, with like, I probably wouldn't, but if I were to make a YouTube video with the title of "Why You Can't Be Racist to White People," I would love for it to be in the point counterpoint format. That this is what I would have said, and this is a response, and then you might say this, and then the response is that, and hopefully leading the viewer down a path similar to how in the Courage to Be Disliked, you start off with one thing, and then you're like, okay, I've launched all my counterpoints at you, and I'm led to this conclusion where I kind of have to change my mind, which was the sort of experience I had through reading that book. I think that's the experience you had as well. And that's the experience I have whenever I read a well-defended piece of analysis about a particular point, where I think, okay, cool, you've addressed all of the queries, all of the immediate things that came to my mind, and you've led me to this conclusion, and that is why I now believe what I believe. And that's what I would like to be able to do. I'd love my kind of knowledge and education about the subject to get to a point where I can do that for most of these topics.
Yes, I agree that if your view is to create a piece of content that would appeal to the other side or whatever, then presenting things in that way would be helpful. I agree with that. The point that I'm trying to make is slightly different. The point that I'm trying to make is that if you are personally, okay, for example, let me propose an alternate approach to trying to understand the other side. I think it's more useful to try and sort of build up a case for and empathy and understanding for each side from the ground up separately, and then to try and understand how they come together and ultimately disagree. I think that is a better way to understand both sides. I think if you have sort of built up a case for one side already, you're a lefty or whatever, and so you're pro all of this stuff, and you've kind of built up that case, and now you're trying to use the points of criticism as an entry point into understanding the other side. I think in theory it could work. I think in practice there's like lots of traps to fall into. It can lead you down lots of unproductive lines of thinking and lines of argument that they often miss the main point. And to a large extent, I think the other side, when they bring, when someone brings up an issue like looting or whatever, I think to a large extent it's a like reactionary thing of, okay, I don't like that tribe. They're doing this bad thing over there, so they can't possibly be right anyway because they're doing this bad thing. So let's draw attention to this bad thing. And I think that there's a lot of that goes on. And so if you focus on this, like, let's read the critique and then the counter critique and all of that kind of stuff, you will get bogged down in most of that kind of BS. However, if you seek to sort of try to understand the other side from the ground up, you will sort of develop some empathy for why they want to believe what they believe. I think what the wanting to believe is really crucial here, because I think on all sides, the starting position is I want to believe something. I want to believe whatever thing, and based on your based on the environment you've grown up in and the other sort of beliefs you subscribe to, you will want to believe. You will have an instinctive response of wanting to believe the Black Lives Matter movement or wanting to believe the other side. And then I think a lot of the discourse is just like, BS sort of justifications and rationalizations about why the thing you want to believe is actually correct. And so my point is, if you are approaching learning about these issues in that in the way of like looking at critiques and counter critiques, I think you are mostly going to get caught up in BS that isn't the main point that either side actually care about. And that's all I'm trying to say, that like don't put so much weight on critiques. And partly why I feel strongly about this is because I think in the past I used to put far too much weight on critiques. And if I sort of read something, it's kind of what you describe. You read something from one expert, then another expert, like in inverted commas, debunks it or whatever. Then you're like, oh, okay, I guess he's right. And then you go back, oh, okay, I guess he's right or whatever. I think I used to overweight critiques and miss the main point of most things. And I would I just want to throw some caution about that.
Okay, yeah, I buy that. That seems very reasonable. It sounds like what you're saying is that actually a lot of these issues and a lot of the things that will come up. I'm sort of imagining I'm sort of imagining a tree, and a lot of the kind of critique is about the branches and the leaves of that tree. Whereas if you can really seek to understand the trunk of the tree, you actually don't need to touch on a lot of the things because it just addresses so much. Whereas you can spend your whole life trying to tackle all the different leaves and all the different aspects of this, be like, oh, but that, and never end up really fully understanding the core of the belief system.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's a really good metaphor. I'm very impressed.
Thank you. So with that in mind, how do I go about understanding the other? I barely understand like our side's tree. So I think the first step is probably to understand our side's tree. The first step is probably to understand our side's tree by reading more about this stuff, and then being like, okay, I can make a pretty reasoned argument as to why we believe what we believe. Even though that is what I want to believe. Keeping that in mind, let me try and figure out a little bit like how would you go about figuring out the other sides of it? Like, do you want to read it? I mean, I can't think of anything immediately on the top of my head other than watching videos about anti-Black Lives Matter or kind of reading Mein Kampf or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Mein Kampf is more of a trunk rather than a leaves thing. But I believe I have cottoned on to an author who might be able to help with this. So I bought a couple of books on Kindle recently. One is called Discrimination and Disparities. It's by a guy called Thomas Sowell, something like that. And another one is called A Conflict of Visions by the same guy. And I believe these books present a sort of a trunk-like discourse against all the kind of social justice movement and kind of ways of thinking about things. I believe that, I mean, not explicitly against it. Like, it's not like this guy saw some SJWs and was like, no, I don't like those people, I'm going to write a thing against it. I believe it proposes a different way of viewing all of this stuff that in large part goes against the social justice movement, social justice kind of rhetoric, methodology, whatever you want to call it. It's a guy called Thomas Sowell, Sowell, Discrimination and Disparities and A Conflict of Visions. Those seem interesting. Yeah, it's A Conflict of Visions. The subtitle is Ideological Origins of Political Struggles. And I don't think the other one has a subtitle. But yeah, I bought those. I think it would be pretty interesting to kind of, I think it will be an interesting trunk-like view into the other side.
I think also, I was thinking like for the next episode, like you and I are pretty, practically laymen who are staunch lefties, but that's because we want to be staunch lefties. We actually don't know anything about this. I wonder if we know anyone, or if anyone who's listening to this, this hour and a half and is reasonably kind of well versed in these topics, if it would be worth bringing someone on as a guest to kind of just explain what's going on in a way that we haven't really done this episode. I feel like this episode's been a lot of sort of I kind of approached this from the assumption that obviously everyone listening to this is pro Black Lives Matter, and obviously that's the right side of the fence to be on. And I'm sort of querying what kind of the nuances are. But I don't think it's particularly satisfying discussion for anyone who's not sort of identity-wise a staunch lefty, if that makes sense. Do we know anyone who'd be up for hanging out?
I don't know really. I think it's tough to have guests on when it's remote. I think we've tried this before in the past. So I don't think it's ideal. So
no, I mean, it's not ideal in terms of like a sort of a banter perspective, but I think kind of given what's going on in the world, we don't need to prioritize banter, and we can actually just think about having someone on who knows what they're talking about some of these issues.
Yeah, maybe I know some people. I don't know. We can have a think.
Okay. Good place.
Yeah. There's one final thing I want to touch on.
Yes, please do.
The final thing I want to touch on is righteousness. And I think righteousness is a huge factor in why communication is so poor across the divide. Now, I think we had this discussion in a group chat with our...
I'm actually desperate for a wee. I'll be right back.
And this is a pretty long wee. He's been gone for about 5 minutes now.
Sorry, I'm back. You were talking about righteousness.
Yeah. Just to bring up a quick side note on my earlier point, I think A Conflict of Visions is more the book that you're looking for. much more so than discrimination disparities.
I'm buying that on Kindle right now. Not sponsored.
Okay, yeah. So my point about righteousness. So I think, the scenario in which you made that tweet about like, a lot of white people get so triggered when you say that I'm racist to white people. I think we had a discussion in this group chat, which you may recall. I think this is a common dynamic that plays out in all sorts of these discussions, because it's one of those scenarios where both sides will go away feeling largely frustrated. Like, for example, the person telling you that you can't be racist to white people and you not getting it, that person will go away feeling frustrated of like, this guy just isn't getting it. And the person who's being told that to will go away feeling frustrated that like, I've no idea what this other person's talking about. That's so obviously wrong. But both sides will go away with a sort of a satisfying sense of righteousness that sort of the other person is wrong, bad, whatever you want to call it. The sort of the person who's trying to tell you that you can't be racist to white people will they'll mostly go away with a negative sentiment, but then there may also be a sliver of sort of a feeling of righteousness of like, haha, that's stupid racist or whatever. And that sort of feeling of righteousness is why you made that tweet and why you knew that the rest of the tribe would like that tweet. It's because it gives you a sense of righteousness. And the person on the other side will go away with a sense of righteousness of like, oh my God, yeah, I knew those people were like ridiculous all along. Like, how can I take this seriously? Like, that's obviously not true. And so the sort of sense of righteousness kind of reinforces each person into their own positions. And like I said, both go away feeling largely frustrated, and that leads them to dislike each other. And it's this sort of tragic deadlock that happens constantly in these discussions. And it's obviously like net negative, like very net negative, that these two people have failed at communicating with one another and they've both gone away feeling frustrated. But there's this like sliver of feeling of righteousness that kind of makes people keep doing it. Because even though it's like largely a negative outcome for both parties, there's like this little bit of candy in the form of the righteousness that kind of reinforces it. And so I think
I think this is sort of the case with any sort of debate where it is a matter of identity, like Windows versus Mac. Both parties will walk away from that with a feeling of righteousness. The Windows crowd is going to think that, oh yeah, he's clearly just paying all this money for these specs that don't even matter, and blah blah blah. And the Mac crowd is going to think, oh my God, this guy, clearly he's focusing too much on the numbers and not enough on the user experience. And both parties will walk away from that conversation thinking that, I'm supporting Apple, not Microsoft.
Yeah, exactly. And so in a sense, it's like, but both sides are kind of getting higher on their own supply. I think that's a good analogy. And it obviously doesn't benefit either of them. But yeah, I think it's good to try and note. It's very helpful to try and notice when you personally feel the sense of righteousness. I don't know what good can come out of a sense of righteousness over your fellow man, but I think being able to tell when that's happening with you is a really good first step to then being able to take a step back and thinking, okay, like what's my actual frame of mind here? Am I just like doing this as like a tribalism thing? Do I actually care about like, is my primary purpose actually to communicate with this other person, or is it to just like reinforce my own tribe or whatever? I think like learning to notice when you feel righteous and trying to unpack that has definitely been helpful for me.
Oh, that's an interesting way of framing it. I think back in the day, I used to watch a lot of, Ben Shapiro owns this SJW type videos on YouTube.
Right. Yeah.
Which is absolutely not the case. Absolutely not the way to get at truth. It's the way to fuel your own confirmation bias, fuel your own sense of righteousness. I've now stopped doing those things, but I think framing it as a sort of recognizing that sense of righteousness within yourself and recognizing it as probably a negative prognostic factor for the thing that you're trying to do is very helpful.
Yep. That was just the final point I wanted to make. I guess we can read a review and maybe there's some insights. Any insights from you this week, Ali?
I had a few things. I'll save that for next time because we're at 1 hour and 37 minutes now.
Okay. Let me see my insights recently. Okay. Here's my insight. Oh yeah. I think I messaged you when I had this, and I said, I've got a great thing to bring up on the next podcast. So earlier this week, at the start of the week, so I bought a PS4 last week. I think did I mention this on the last episode? I think I did.
I don't know if the last episode is actually the podcast because we're changing
Yeah,
around, aren't we?
Yeah. Anyway, I bought a PS4 last week to be able to play games with my friend because I felt like that would be a more meaningful meaningful way to socialize than having like a group call or whatever. And I had a session on the PS4 with a couple of friends. You know them, Sahib and Shuaib. We all played some Warzone. We're all like relatively bad at it. Anyway, it was like a ton of fun. It was like it was fun for exactly the reasons that I thought it would be, which is that it kind of gives you something to sort of keep your hands occupied while you just chat about random stuff, and occasionally you get a kill, and that feels good as well. And I think it got me thinking about like why did that session with the lads on the PS4, why did that feel so much better than if we'd had like a group video call or something? And I think here's what it comes down to. I think when we are hanging out with people, when we're trying to connect with our fellow man, what we want is to experience the essence of another person, is to experience the essence of the other person. And certain things are more, certain things kind of promote experiencing the essence of the other person more than others. And so, for example, Sahib's a friend, a very old friend of ours from school. We don't hang out in real life that often, a few times a year or something. We have this group chat and stuff, but we're old friends or whatever. And our relationship is not, it's not really focused around like, sort of life update stuff. Like, mostly when you catch up with sort of university friends, for example, or whatever, someone who you don't see that often, it'll be kind of focused around like life updates. Oh, cool. How's work? How's the girlfriend? Oh, still single. Oh, that's a shame. This kind of stuff. And if Sahib and I went for dinner or something, yeah, I'm sure it'd be fun or whatever. But I don't think Sahib and I going for dinner would really let us experience each other's essence in the way that we'd want. The experiencing each other's essence in the context of me and a friend like Sahib is just sitting around doing some random thing and then just like, chatting about random stuff that comes up, And yeah, some kinds of social sessions are kind of detrimental to experiencing the essence of another person. And I think I have certainly found that having a Zoom video call with a friend or a group Zoom video call is almost always detrimental to experiencing the other person's essence, because there are very few like friends in my life with whom I don't know that would bring out the essence of both of us if we have like a Zoom video call or something. I think this podcast is cool because in a lot of ways you and I sort of experience each other's essence when we talk about random things like this, like overthinking kind of stuff. It's the conversation we have in the car and things like that. So I think the podcast is a good way for us to do that. However, it's different with different people. And I found that while we were playing PS4, we didn't really do the whole like life update thing of like, oh, are you working from home? Or, all this kind of stuff. I mean, at some point, the topic of like working from home and doing Zoom happy hours with your colleagues kind of came up, but it came up organically, sort of within the frame of experiencing each other's essence, rather than coming up as sort of like a side thing on its own. And so it was like, I'll stop talking there. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's similar to what's his face is Jimmy Carter's. No, not Jimmy Carter. Jimmy thingy's about Jimmy Carr.
Looking in the same direction.
Yeah, looking in the same direction. And I think kind of when you're playing video games, you're very much looking in the same direction. Although you've now convinced me to get a PS4. Which one should I get? I'm on game.com.
I don't know.
Right now.
I just got like the cheap one. It was like £250
from Amazon or elsewhere.
Yeah, Amazon Prime. Yeah,
nice. Okay, and
yeah, get it, but it's good fun.
And what game? So I should get Warzone.
Yeah, Warzone's free. You can just download that once you have it.
Oh, it's free.
Yeah.
How does that work?
I think you can buy vanity upgrades and things.
Oh, wait. So
that's the model nowadays.
There's this one that's
free to play.
That's 255 quid PS4. It's the non-pro version. Have you got the non-pro?
Yeah. I think I got the non-pro version. Look, I'm not a serious gamer. I got this to hang out with my friends. But I think you're slightly missing my point, which is that
I understand your point, but
okay.
But you sold me on buying a PlayStation. I've been kind of toying with it for a while, but haven't really got around to it.
Yeah, my point is that with different people, you experience each other's essence in different ways. For someone like me and Sahib, playing PS4 together is much more conducive to experiencing each other's essence than having a Zoom call. But there are some friends where having a Zoom call and chatting about stuff like this is more in line with how we do it. Anyway, that's my insight. experiencing the essence of our fellow man, let's just read a review and call it quits. This has been a long podcast. It's almost 2 hours at this point, but I think it's been a good discussion.
Have you got PlayStation Plus, this 12-month membership? Is that what you need?
Oh yeah, I think you need to buy a thing to be able to play online.
Free delivery by tomorrow, is that right?
Man, if Zencaster messes up with this recording after this 2-hour episode, I'm going to be seriously pissed. We're using Zencaster to sort of record this remotely in the browser on the fly, and I have no idea if it's going to work.
Yep.
Okay, review for this week. This comes from someone from Great Britain. It's entitled Fair Play. They say, thought the two of you were waste men, but when I listened more, and now I find you two interesting. Fair play. Fair play. James Acaster likes to say fair play a lot.
Oh, no.
He kind of says it in that particular way. Fair play. So I think that's kind of how he talks. All right. I think we'll call it a day. Good stuff. See you next time. Thanks for listening. I'm going to click stop recording now. Let's see what happens.
That's it for this week. Thank you for listening.
If you like this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the Apple Podcasts website if you're not using an iPhone. There's a link in the show notes.
If you've got any thoughts on this episode or any ideas for new podcast topics, we'd love to get an audio message from you with your conundrum, question, or just anything that we could discuss.
Yeah, if you're up for having your voice played on the podcast and your question being the springboard for our discussion, email us an audio file MP3 or voice note to hi@notoverthinking.com.
If you've got thoughts but you'd rather not have your voice played publicly, that's fine as well. Tweet or DM us at NOverthinking on Twitter, please.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.